The morning mist clung tightly to the steep and unforgiving slopes of Mount Morgarten on a freezing November day in the year 1315. Duke Leopold of Austria rode proudly at the head of a glittering column of armored knights who were supremely confident in their martial superiority over the peasant rabble they intended to punish. The narrow and treacherous path along the frozen shores of Lake Agery forced the heavy cavalry into a constricted single-file line that stretched for miles, effectively neutralizing their overwhelming numerical advantage. High above them, concealed within the dense and silent tree line, waited the determined men of Schwyz-Uri and Unterwalden, holding their breath as the deadly trap was finally set. Suddenly, the silence of the Alpine Pass was shattered by the thunderous roar of massive logs and boulders crashing down from the ridge above. The avalanche of timber and stones smashed into the Austrian column, crushing horses and riders alike while creating panic and confusion in the ranks. Before the knights could recover from the shock, the Swiss Confederates charged down the slope with terrifying speed. They did not wield the chivalric swords of the nobility, but rather brutal farming tools modified for war, including the fearsome halberd, which could cleave through helmets and armor with a single swing. The carnage that followed was absolute and lacked any semblance of the mercy typically shown between noble combatants in the Middle Ages. The heavy Austrian cavalry, trapped between the freezing lake and the steep mountainside, had no room to maneuver or retreat. Panic spread like wildfire as knights were dragged from their saddles and slaughtered in the mud by men they considered their inferiors. Duke Leopold barely escaped with his life, witnessing the total destruction of his army. This was the Battle of Morgarten, and it sent a shockwave through Europe that signaled the dawn of a new era in warfare. For centuries, the armored knight had been the undisputed master of the medieval battlefield, dominating every engagement with speed and iron protection. The feudal system relied on this military supremacy to maintain control over the peasantry and the lower classes. However, the events at Morgarten challenged this long-standing social order. The survival of the forest cantons was at stake as the House of Habsburg sought to consolidate its power and control the vital trade routes through the St. Gotthard Pass. Defeat for the Swiss would mean total subjugation and the loss of their ancient rights. To understand how a collection of Alpine farmers could defy the greatest dynasty in Europe, we must look at the unique geography of their homeland. The rugged terrain of the Swiss Alps acted as a natural fortress that negated the advantages of heavy cavalry. Living in these harsh valleys required a level of communal cooperation and physical toughness that translated perfectly into military discipline. Unlike the feudal levies of other nations, the Swiss militias were composed of free men who were fighting for their own homes and families rather than for a distant lord. The primary weapon of these early Confederates was the halberd and axe blade on a 6-foot pole topped with a spike and a hook. It was a versatile instrument capable of pulling a knight from his horse or crushing plate armor with a heavy overhead blow. However, the halberd had a significant weakness in open fields where cavalry could charge freely. To counter this, the Swiss began to adopt and perfect a weapon of ancient design that had been largely forgotten since the time of Alexander the Great. This weapon was the pike. The Swiss pike was a massive ash wood spear measuring between 15 and 18 feet in length, with a long steel point. When massed together in a tight formation, these weapons created an impenetrable wall of steel points that no horse would dare to charge. This formation was known as the Juwalthofen, or the Pike Square. It was not merely a defensive posture, but a mobile fortress that could move across the battlefield and crush enemy lines through sheer weight and momentum. Developing the coordination required to maneuver a formation of several thousand men required rigorous training and absolute discipline. The Swiss reintroduced the concept of drilling to European warfare, marching in step to the beat of drums and the sound of fifes. Every man knew his place in the rank and file and understood that his survival depended on the man standing next to him. If a soldier in the front line fell, the man behind him would immediately step forward to fill the gap, ensuring the wall of spears remained unbroken. Let us focus on a representative figure of this era to understand the human element of the phalanx. We will follow Ulrich, a stoic Swiss pikeman in his late 20s, with a square jaw and blue eyes. Ulrich was not a professional soldier by birth, but a cowherd who spent his summers in the high pastures. Like his neighbors, he was required by cantonal law to own his weapons and participate in regular military drills. His loyalty was not to a king, but to his canton and his fellow soldiers. Ulrich and his comrades wore simple identification marks such as a white cross on their clothing to distinguish themselves in the chaos of battle. They carried no shields, relying instead on the reach of their pikes and the aggressive momentum of their charge. The psychological impact of a Swiss column marching in silence before breaking into a terrifying roar was often enough to break the nerve of their enemies before contact was even made. This aggression was a calculated tactic designed to seize the initiative. The effectiveness of these tactics was tested again at the Battle of Sempach in 1386. Once again, a Habsburg army under a different Duke Leopold sought to crush the Confederates. The Austrian knights, having learned from Morgarten, dismounted to fight on foot, hoping to negate the Swiss advantage. The battle began as a stalemate, with the Swiss unable to penetrate the wall of Austrian lances. The heat was sweltering, and the Confederates were suffering heavy casualties as the armored knights held their ground. It is here that legend introduces the hero Arnold von Winkelried, a man from Unterwalden. According to tradition, seeing that the Swiss attack was failing, Winkelried shouted a final pledge to care for his wife and children. He then charged forward alone and gathered as many Austrian lance points as he could into his own body, dragging them down with him as he fell. His sacrifice created a momentary gap in the enemy line. Whether the story of Winkelried is fact or myth, the result was undeniably real. Ulrich and the Swiss vanguard poured into the breach created in the Austrian line. Once inside the reach of the long lances, the Austrian knights were at a severe disadvantage against the Swiss sidearms and halberds. The heavy armor that protected the knights became a liability in the crush and heat. The Austrian formation collapsed, and Duke Leopold III was killed, along with the flower of his nobility. The victory at Sempach cemented the reputation of the Swiss as the most ferocious infantry in Europe. They developed a policy of taking no prisoners, which served a dual purpose. Tactically, it meant they did not have to spare men to guard captives. Psychologically, it struck terror into their enemies, who knew that defeat meant certain death. This brutality became a trademark of Swiss warfare and a powerful deterrent against invasion. As the 15th century progressed, the Swiss Confederacy expanded, and their military prowess attracted the attention of foreign powers. The cantons began to rent out their soldiers as mercenaries known as Reisläufer. These contracts brought immense wealth to the Alpine valleys, but also entangled the Swiss in the complex politics of Europe. The Pike Square was no longer just a tool of defense, but a highly exportable military asset. The greatest test for the Swiss phalanx came in the form of Charles the Bold, the ambitious Duke of Burgundy. Charles possessed the most modern army in Europe, equipped with heavy ordnance, powerful cavalry, and English longbowmen. He aimed to create a kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, and the Swiss stood in his way. The resulting conflict, known as the Burgundian Wars, would prove to be the undoing of the Burgundian state. In 1476, Charles laid siege to the castle of Grandson on Lake Neuchâtel. After the garrison surrendered, they were executed by the Burgundians, a violation of the rules of war that enraged the Swiss. The Confederate army arrived shortly after and caught the Burgundian army unprepared. As the Swiss squares descended from the hills, Charles attempted to reposition his artillery and cavalry, but the maneuver caused panic among his troops. The sight of the relentless Swiss columns marching through the vineyard terraces caused the Burgundian army to disintegrate. Charles the Bold fled, leaving behind his magnificent artillery train and a camp filled with treasure. The Swiss, who were mostly poor farmers, looted the camp, capturing jewels, tapestries, and gold worth a fortune. However, they were so unfamiliar with luxury that many sold priceless gems for mere copper coins. Charles was humiliated but not defeated. He raised a new army and besieged the town of Merton just a few months later. The Swiss Confederates mobilized once again, joined by allies from Lorraine and Austria, who feared the Burgundian expansion. The Battle of Merton would be one of the bloodiest encounters of the Middle Ages. The Swiss attacked under the cover of a heavy rainstorm, catching the Burgundians while they were still in their camp. The speed of the Swiss advance was devastating. The pike squares smashed through the Burgundian defenses and pinned the enemy against the lake. There was no escape and no mercy. Thousands of Burgundian soldiers were pushed into the water and drowned, while others were cut down in the camp. The power of the Burgundian state was broken in a single afternoon. The victory at Merton demonstrated that the Pike Phalanx could defeat a combined force of guns and cavalry in the open field. The final act of the tragedy played out at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. Charles the Bold, desperate and commanding a depleted army, faced the Swiss and their allies in the freezing winter mud. The battle was short and decisive. The Swiss overwhelmed the Burgundian lines, and in the chaotic retreat Charles was struck down. His body was found days later, half-eaten by wolves, with his face frozen in the ice. With the destruction of Burgundy, the Swiss were undisputed as the masters of the battlefield. Kings from France to Italy clamored to hire them, paying exorbitant sums for their service. The Swiss pike square became the model for all other armies. The German Emperor Maximilian I was so impressed that he created his own imitation of the Swiss infantry, known as the Landsknechts. The rivalry between the Swiss and the German Landsknechts became legendary. Both used the pike in similar formations, but they hated each other with a passion. When they met on the battlefield, it was known as bad war, meaning that no quarter would be given and no prisoners taken. These encounters were exceptionally bloody, pushing the brutality of push of pike warfare to its absolute limit. The tactic known as the push of pike occurred when two opposing phalanxes collided head-on. The front ranks would lock their pikes together, creating a deadly scrum where men stabbed and thrust at each other at close range. The pressure from the ranks behind pushing forward was immense, often crushing the men in the front. It was a terrifying experience that required nerves of steel and absolute unit cohesion. By the early 16th century, the Swiss were deeply involved in the Italian wars, fighting for various popes and dukes. However, the technology of war was changing rapidly. The development of more mobile field artillery and the improvement of handheld firearms began to challenge the dominance of the pike. The dense formations of the Swiss square presented an ideal target for cannonballs, which could plow through rank after rank of men. The turning point came at the Battle of Marignano in 1515. The Swiss army, confident in their invincibility, attacked a French army that was fortified with extensive artillery and supported by heavy cavalry. For 2 days, the Swiss launched wave after wave of assaults, attempting to overrun the French guns. The fighting was ferocious, with the Swiss gaining ground despite taking horrific casualties from the cannon fire. However, the arrival of Venetian allies to support the French tipped the balance. The Swiss, exhausted and outnumbered, were finally forced to retreat. Marignano was a catastrophic defeat that shattered the aura of Swiss invincibility. It marked the end of the era where infantry alone could dominate the battlefield without support from other arms. The lesson was learned in blood. Following Marignano, the Swiss Confederacy began to withdraw from aggressive foreign expansion. They signed a treaty of perpetual peace with France and moved toward a policy of neutrality that would eventually define the nation. While Swiss mercenaries continued to serve abroad for centuries, the cantons themselves ceased to act as a belligerent power in European conquests. One enduring legacy of this martial tradition is the Pontifical Swiss Guard. Founded in 1506, they remain the personal bodyguard of the Pope to this day. While their colorful uniforms, designed in the Renaissance style, may look ceremonial, they are all trained soldiers who carry on the traditions of discipline and loyalty that were forged in the blood of Morgarten Sempach. The evolution of warfare continued, moving toward the pike and shot era, where musketeers were integrated into the pike formations. The pike remained a crucial weapon on the battlefield for another 200 years, protecting the vulnerable gunners from cavalry charges. It was not until the invention of the bayonet that the spear was finally retired from military service. The story of the Swiss Pike Phalanx is a testament to the power of unity and discipline over individual prowess. It overturned the social hierarchy of the Middle Ages, proving that common men fighting for a common cause could could defeat the elite warrior caste. The long spears of the Alpine peasants did more than just win battles, they pierced the heart of the feudal system and paved the way for modern infantry tactics. Today, the peaceful landscapes of Switzerland betray little of this violent past. The fields of Sempach and Merten are quiet, and the pass at Morgarten is a scenic route for tourists. Yet the independence of the Swiss nation stands as a living monument to those pike squares. It serves as a reminder of a time when the sound of Swiss drums struck fear into the hearts of kings, and the long ash pike ruled the battlefield.